Good morning, everyone. I will call to order this special work session of the Mayor and Commission. Today is June 13th, and the time is 10:02. We've got a couple items on the agenda, and we will start with the Banyan Street Garage. Discussion and direction. Mr. Roog?
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners, members from the public. Today we're going to be discussing and sharing the findings from the Banyan Parking Garage Redevelopment Study Phase 1. With us today is a consultant that helped on that. That's Concourse Group, and representing Concourse Group is Andrea Elson from Concourse. And I just want to start out by saying this study has been a real pleasure. I just want to take a moment, Mayor, and just thank everybody that participated. We did quite a bit of community outreach, the business community, the residents, our cultural partners, everybody out there that participated. Just if you're watching at home, thank you so much. It has been a real pleasure just discussing this with all of you. So we're going to do, I'm just going to kind of do a quick overview just to sort of do a level set of what we're talking about today, where the Banyan Garage is, things like that. Then I'm going to turn it over to Andrea to go through the study. There's a lot of great information, and then, of course, questions and then direction on how to move forward. So just for reference purposes, the Banyan Garage is located at, there's 4 garages on Banyan Boulevard, so just to be clear, this is the easternmost one, located at 200 Banyan Boulevard. On the east and west side is Narcissus, and on the west side is Olive Avenue. Just to the north is Flagler Banyan Square, formerly the old City Hall site, and then the Drama Works Theater is just to the south of the southwest corner. And that is it, right in the middle. So this garage has had a long history going back since 2015. And then just over the years, there's been, I'm not going to get into all of these details, but there has been a lot of sort of investigation into this asset and a lot of studies from just discussing it internally with department heads all the way to some really nice pie, I would say blue sky renderings that was done by Ecosystema. And then just throughout the years, there's been talk about doing a public-private partnership that ultimately led us to a resolution that was adopted earlier this year to actually conduct a study to find out if a public-private partnership, which was the desire of the City Commission, to investigate that and understand if a P3 opportunity is viable for the Banyan Street Garage. So as part of their scope, there was an interlocal funding agreement between the CRA and City to fund this study, and it was not to exceed $76,000. The deliverables included quite a bit of information, which you're about to hear, and then ultimately that was going to be shared with the City Commission, which is what we're doing today. So now I would like to bring up Andrea from Concourse Group, and while she is here, there were a couple of other members from the Concourse team that also helped on this, Mark and Brandon, but Andrea will be going over the data that was collected during the study. Andrea?
Before we begin, are we expecting the President to be here? Is she out today? All right, we'll proceed. I was just curious. Okay, thank you.
All right, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Mr. Mayor, Commissioners, and other interested parties. We've been working on this since February, so it's really exciting to kind of be in a place where we have some things to talk about and give the Commission much to think about, I believe. Sorry, Chris, I must find your page down button. We'll just use that. There you go. Just wanted to start by giving you a little bit of an overview of how we approached this assignment, the Phase 1 feasibility study. We held a kickoff meeting with, I just counted about 25 representatives from the city, all sorts of departments across the board, just to kind of hear thoughts and concerns and things like that about how a study might want to go forward and things to consider. We kind of met with many of them over time, over the course of refining assumptions and things. We assembled and reviewed and looked at all sorts of plans, the downtown plan, the shore plan, shore to core plan, all sorts of background data. We assembled real estate market data and everything we need to make an assessment of the feasibility of redevelopment in general and through P3 in particular. After that, we had something much more extensive outreach than we typically do, and I'll go into that in a little bit with both with the city, with local developers, with local businesses, and the broader community as well. So quite extensive and lots of input there. From there, we really analyzed things 6 ways till Tuesday. I'm running lots of different scenarios related to development type uses, number of stories, all sorts of things like that, and we'll talk about that again. And then really wrapping everything up comprehensively so that there's a report that documents our assumptions and things. So that's where we are right now. Typically when we do feasibility assessments, we start with the basics, so looking at site characteristics. Fairly straightforward in this case in that it's an urban location, rectangular site, it's got good access, good utilities, things like that. Of course, the biggest part of this is that it's got a heavily used public parking garage as part of it. That's got to be considered as through all aspects of the redevelopment. We also look at regulatory considerations, so often it's things like natural resources, environmental, historical, kind of those types of considerations. In this case, the most complicated factor we were working with was the zoning, so the kind of the interplay between parking and height limits and floor area ratio or FAR, and how those all affect what can happen on the site under the existing zoning code. It's complicated, and our results are basically depending on the types of uses and things, some 100,000 to 130,000 square feet of space outside of a garage would be available for construction. And then the next part, we spent a lot of time getting input from the city staff and really came out of there with some working assumptions that form the basis of our analysis. We've heard loud and clear that this wants to be a ground lease transaction. The city is not interested in selling the land, wants to retain this as an asset over the long term. We've assumed no city or CRA funding to help facilitate the project. We've assumed that there will be 350 public spaces replaced on site, as well as any additional parking necessary for new uses. So for example, if there's office space that has its own parking requirement, that would go on top of the 350 spaces. Let's see, we looked at different types of ways of handling the city garage or the city operations of the parking, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. And let's see, we also worked with different departments to hear the types and extent of space they would like to see in the garage to help support event planning in the area and things like that. And I think another key bit of staff input that we heard that isn't on this slide is that we did hear that, since going back to several years, there's been substantial developer interest in this site, and both in the form of a public-private partnership and just recognizing the importance of this site to the community. From there, then we started into more of the real estate market analysis. We're fortunate in this case in that CoStar is active in West Palm Beach because it's such a, they consider it a pretty major real estate market. We looked at multifamily, so apartments. We looked at office. We looked at retail. We looked at hospitality, so hotels, things like that. And what we see across the board is a little bit, things aren't going as gangbusters as they were a few years ago, but still considered a very solid market across the uses. There's some increases in supply that are changing, just taking a little time to be absorbed, but still considered a strong market. And then we also reached out to some members of the development community as they would be the partners here, most likely, to hear what their thoughts were on what could be constructed here, or what they would like to see or see possible. And we heard probably high-end multifamily, so high-end apartments most frequently, the possibility of workforce housing, hotel and event space being a strong demand factor, as well as office. A couple things they also said is they suspected it would be difficult to make the economics of a project work without the developer, the project, at least receiving some of the parking revenues associated with those 350 spaces. And especially complicated is the 8-story height limit doesn't leave a whole lot of room to develop after you put the parking up. And I guess to kind of foot stomp what we heard both from the city and from the development community is that this is a really important garage to the area, to the businesses, to the residents, and everyone understands that and understands how disruptive it would be if it were to close for redevelopment, things like that. Okay. From there, we reached out to the local businesses in the area. The DDA was sent an email and an invitation to kind of a virtual discussion back in April. Not terribly well attended, but we did get some interesting feedback. Again, we heard the garage is critical to the business. Things that they would like to see in the area would be artist and workforce type housing, some modern office space that's reasonably priced, and restaurants geared more towards workers rather than, lunchtime workers rather than people spending a great deal of time, having time to sit down and have a real long leisurely lunch or dinner. Some saw it as a chance to do something iconic in the area, and having, walked it, I think, it's clearly an important connection between along Banyan Boulevard and an interesting opportunity for sure. And again, they noted the concern about the parking and what would happen during a construction and development process. And then there was clearly a need to reach out or to a few other businesses in the area expressed interest and wanted to, talk about it more with concerns and things like that. So we had an additional discussion with a local property owner, and they really thought that the parking is the primary need at that garage, at the Banyan garage, but that other uses that would be appropriate would be multifamily or hotel or retail. They suggested that in terms of if going to a request for proposal or an RFP, that really select the optimal use or the use the city would like to see, and then let the developers kind of have some flexibility in figuring out how to put that together, something we typically recommend as well. And, acknowledged again the issues of parking with closing down the garage for any period of time. And then the second discussion is really, it was kind of a different nature, and out of it came the suggestion that the city consider renovating the garage rather than the redevelopment. They just felt that the city doesn't need another magnet project to bring people downtown. What they need is the parking to support the people that are downtown. They didn't think that a slight cost increase to the parking would be that big of a deal to their patrons, and really felt that businesses in this area are very fragile, and closing the garage for 1 to 2 years would be really, really difficult for them. People change their habits and things like that. So we didn't analyze the non-redevelopment aspect of this, the renovation possibility, but just did want to make sure that you all understood that it was raised as a concept. From there, then we went out to the larger community. We worked with the Mosaic Group, who helped us kind of work through the city with the brand and questions and kind of a common vision for Envision Banyan. Went out to social media, print, just distributed materials, worked with the media, did an email campaign to some 3,500 recipients, and then had both a virtual visioning session and an online survey. And I'll go through some of the highlights of those on the next couple slides. So as far as the visioning workshop goes, we had 34 community members participate and really see a lot of things geared toward kind of creating more of, I guess, a sense of place in this area. So community spaces, so like the YMCA or business incubation, co-working type things. Definitely a trend towards small businesses, young families, reflecting the important link to the waterfront and development that encourages people to come there. Parking should be affordable. There was not a lot of interest in very high-rise development, and just kind of support for thinking a little bit more outside the box with things like food stores and supermarkets, or things that are not currently extensively in the area. And the second part of that was the online survey, so a much larger response, 234 surveys, but really a very different perspective. I mean, most supported re-envisioning the Banyan Street garage, which I think would be consistent between the two. But when asked what uses would be most important, really 47% ended up saying parking, which is a really interesting result. And then the next things down were retail, community meeting, event type space, then housing, and then kind of some other luxury retail and community space, and then housing, and then below that, others. I'll give you a second to take notes here.
Yeah, Commissioner Lambert.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the demographics of the individuals who completed the survey? I mean, were they downtown residents? Were they residents from throughout the city? Stakeholders? Do you know?
I don't have that information. Do you have that information?
So Mosaic did the...
You need talking to the mic, Chris.
Mosaic did the survey, so we'd have to go back and look at if they have the breakdown by demographic. We do have a summary of the Mosaic Group study that we can show and kind of go through it. But they may have had some information in there about where they're from or where they live.
Yeah, I do have an Excel sheet of everyone who responded and things like that, so I can look into that in more detail. Anything else?
Yeah, go ahead and proceed. I don't think there are any other questions at this point.
Okay. Then we asked some questions to kind of dig into some of the uses that might occur on top of a parking garage, or wrapped around a parking garage, or however that might work. We heard if retail space is included, the preference strongly is for local shops. We heard if office space is included, the preference would be for small businesses, local. And if housing is included, it was a little bit more mixed, but the dominant theme was mixed income housing as the desire. And hotel, the preference was not luxury resort, I think is the way to say that. And then we also collected some information on parking rates, which I didn't put in here. Really the desire was for overall parking rates to stay in line with where they were or be lower than where they are, was the takeaway from that.
Were there any questions about like community activities? We got retail, we got housing, we got office, but I know that I thought I saw earlier, there was a suggestion for a community, I think the YMCA was mentioned specifically. Was that included or provided as an option on the survey? Do we know?
That would not have been presented, like the YMCA would not have been a specific option on there. I'll let,
Well, not the YMCA, a community-type organization to occupy some of the space. So you don't know if that was an option on the questionnaire?
we can check that real
Okay.
quick. Do you have that?
So, as far as like what? As far as what is most important, so, Mayor, are you asking about the community meeting and event space, the 16%?
Yeah, because that didn't seem to be an option on the, well, maybe it just didn't meet the top 10 or top 3.
Correct.
Okay.
But it was referenced
But
as
it
a
was
use.
presented as an option.
Yes.
Okay. Commissioner Ward, I think you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for pointing that out, because I think that lifestyle commentary was very interesting.
Is your mic on?
Can you hear me? No? Okay. You just mentioned that they wanted the rates to stay the same or below, but earlier you said that they wouldn't mind an increase. I thought that was interesting, given all the commentary we've gotten on parking, so could you clarify that?
Sure. The comment I made about parking, the cost could go up slightly. That is what we heard from the business community, that their patrons could absorb a little bit more of a parking increase. Where I said that when asked about where people would like parking rates to be, that was from the broader community survey with the 234 questions. And if you want, we can pull that up and take a look at it, I think.
All right. Commissioner Baduzzi?
My assumption with,
Yeah, I saw it.
my assumption with that would be that when presented with the option of not having any parking for an extended period of time because of significant redevelopment, or having parking available, that their choice would be to, our customers could absorb some of that parking. Would that be a correct assumption, that when it's really they're balancing out the fact of not having parking for an extended period of time, likely?
That's how I interpreted it, yes.
Okay, any other questions at this point? Okay, you can proceed. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, then we looked into the financial feasibility of different public-private partnerships. And like I said earlier, we analyzed things probably 6 times till Tuesday, but we started with kind of a basic replacement parking garage and incorporating the square footage to activate the uses that are required under the zoning. And then we looked at that plus multifamily use, so apartments. And we looked at that parking plus hotel as the focus and parking plus office as the focus. And we also looked at all these, whether they're 5 stories, 6 stories, 7 stories, 8 stories, and really found that for the parking garage, the 5-story worked the best, and for the other uses, the higher you go, the better the economics work. So just what we've got here is a 5-story parking garage and then 8-story buildings, whether they're multifamily, hotel, or office. Our assumptions that we developed kind of in conjunction, we really had to just fix some things so that we could start analyzing, but our assumptions are basically what I talked about earlier. The ground lease arrangement, so no sale, no city or CRA funds put in here. There's about 9,600 square feet of use for the city, assuming that that's put in at the developer's cost, but the city takes care of the operating expenses and things. And then the uses that are required to activate it under the zoning, so the first floor retail or commercial, things like that, the floor area ratio, setbacks, everything else per zoning. So we tried to max out the development under different uses, given that they all have different parking requirements. And, it's, like I said earlier, a complex exercise. But all of it then also assumes 350 public spaces on site plus parking for the additional uses.
Let me ask a quick question. How many floors is 350 parking spaces?
5, more or less, 4 to 5.
4 to 5 floors?
Yep.
And if we keep it at 8 stories, so we're really talking about only 4 stories, 3 to 4 stories of developable. Okay.
Yep, and then with the setbacks, increasing over 5 stories, and there's the need for transfer development rights and things over 5 stories. So there's a lot going on here that we've tried to, simplify into something that helps you think about how to move forward. We've generally, when we put together the income estimates and things like that, so we've run full pro formas on all these. So we're looking at revenues, we're looking at expenses, we're looking at how the parking is treated, we're looking at the costs associated with development, the types of returns a developer we expect that they would require to be interested in the project and things like that. So, both we work with RS means and CoStar numbers, but also benchmark it against different projects we've worked on and different projects happening around the city. So when we run all that, what we really see is kind of confirms what we heard early on, is that it's difficult to make the project work with the development project not receiving the parking revenues. But there's a but with that I'll talk about kind of on the next slide. But anyway, what we've got here in the chart is we looked at the land use scenarios I talked about earlier under 3 different parking scenarios. Number 1 is where the city gets the revenues from the 350 public parking spaces. Number 2 is where the project gets the revenues, but they keep rates where they are with a assumed increase a little bit over time. And then the third option was the project gets the revenues from the 350 public parking spots, but also does a rate increase. So that's number 3, and you can see that results in the highest, or generally the most feasibility across the uses. But when we rank these, what we see is that really hotel demonstrates the highest feasibility potential under these assumptions. And I think a part of that is that it's because of the way the parking is structured. Hotel has the most square footage to play with, and that's part of it, but it's also strength across all the uses. So that's our assessment.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
How did we come up with the 350 parking spaces as a part of the assumption? Is that what's there now?
Yes, it's designed to hold more than that, but based on our discussions with the city, there's about 350 that are earmarked for public use.
Do we know for lack of a better term, the occupancy rate? How much utilization does that garage get on a day-to-day basis? Do we have data on that?
We do.
And
So, and you're right, Mayor, it is in the 90s. So based on the information that we pulled from parking administration, the utilization rate is roughly low 90s during the early parts of the week. And then it gets, it only increases from there. And then I think it peaks around Saturday, Sunday, and then resets. And so, but generally you see that regular low 90s utilization rate.
low 90s of the total, 500 some spots?
350, yes,
Okay,
of the total spots that are in the garage.
94%. Utilization rate, right? 90%?
Utilization rate, yes,
Of the 350?
Yes.
So those 350 are pretty much used then?
yes.
Okay, all right. Commissioner Lambert, then Commissioner Fox.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I understand this chart. So you're saying that hotel option, you've feasibility ranked it as number 1 because in columns 1, 2, and 3, it's either potentially feasible or mainly appears feasible. But if we look at just option 3, there's 3 of them that would appear to be equal in feasibility. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say that they're equal, but they would all be feasible. So I guess it boils down to the same thing, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Fox.
Thank you. I was wondering, with the hotel feasibility, are you just taking into account what you just mentioned about, for example, there's going to be less parking needs if there's a hotel, or are you also taking into account whether or not we need a hotel, whether it's feasible in that location. I'm just curious what were the dynamics that went into deciding a hotel was feasible there?
Sure. Yes, I mean, we look across the street at a very successful hotel. You know, we've priced, our assumption is that the pricing would not be at the Ben level. We've gone really kind of in between. So either you could consider it the very upper level of the lower upscale, or the very bottom of the upper upscale. So we kind of came in under that, and I can show you, or we can go and look at kind of the CoStar projections and things, but we felt like it is based on, you know, our seeing what's happening in the market and talking with the developers, that a hotel would be a reasonable development there.
President Warren.
Hi, with the increased amount of activity, office space, and housing that is going near our downtown, have we looked at increasing the parking spaces in the Banyan Garage? Because I've heard lots of people say that there's issues finding parking downtown. So why wouldn't we look at how we could increase that?
And that would really be kind of the parking option, so the first row in the table. Basically maximizing parking with 5 stories. And that's, again, tough without a rate increase in particular, and assigning those to the public. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, good, Chris.
So, Commissioner, to your point about additional parking, one of the things that we were looking at was looking at our past studies with parking and knowing the amount of total spaces that are available in and around the downtown. And overall, we have a good amount of parking, so it's not necessarily a capacity issue. What's been determined in the past is that it's more of a management issue, which is why we didn't look too much into adding additional capacity at this location, because looking at all of the other parking assets around it, if we could structure the management a little bit differently and sort of influence behavior through parking rates and wayfinding and things like that, that perhaps we could impact that parking perception that it's hard to find parking, and that perhaps there's other ways to help people find the appropriate parking in the right location.
Commissioner Baduzzi.
Thank you. I hear what you're saying, but I think it's significant that there's 90% occupancy currently in that parking garage. And right now, the city is receiving all of that funding. So looking at this chart, I mean, I don't see any great because the most feasible takes it away from the city. The most feasible takes all revenue and gives it to the developer at a 50% increase, or 150% increase in rate, which I don't necessarily think is going to be optimal if we're looking at, if we know that our residents have an issue with the cost of parking in general, and you're taking revenue away from the city. I mean, it seems to me like we need more parking spaces rather than less parking spaces, especially considering the occupancy of 90% plus. And I don't know that these options even address that. And I'd also like to know whether you've been asked to look at, if we just redeveloped it as a parking garage and added spaces, what would that revenue look like to the city versus the tax revenue that's generated through a redevelopment like these projects we're considering?
Yeah, we have not studied the tax revenue at all. I think we could delve in more into the parking revenues and expenses. What we see when we benchmark this is that this is a very profitable parking garage as far as parking garages go. I think, though, what I would like to do is, I said earlier there were going to be some buts. I'd like to move to the next slide and talk about that. That may help kind of
that's fine.
address some of these. So really, our conclusions are, under the current assumptions, hotel seems to make the most sense. But we've made some assumptions that I think can be, guided by what the city wants to do, or your policy, uses that the city would like to see. I think there's ways of making other uses perhaps that are more appealing or more desirable to the community that to happen. So for example, we've assumed that there is no CRA, TIF, or any other kind of funds to help bridge a gap or help kind of write down the costs so that other types of development would make more sense. I think that's one way to do it. Another way is, taking a harder look at the square footage specified for the city use, or perhaps the city pays rent on that space or things like that. And again, I guess we've talked about the bottom two, allowing the P3 partner to operate either at the city's rates or with a rate increase. There's, I think, an opportunity to layer outdoor event space on top of this. That could also increase the revenues and then therefore reduce the dependence on parking revenues as a source to the project. But, it's complicated when the first 5 floors have to go to to fulfill the parking needs. It's hard for a developer to overcome that. But that's what I wanted to point out on this slide. And the other thing, of course, I just wanted to foot stomp again, is that the demolition and construction will be very disruptive to everyone, and that there needs to be we would advise that there would be a plan in place, well before any type of redevelopment happened. And I know Chris has said similar things in all the discussions we've had.
Okay. Commissioner Ward and Commissioner Fox.
So, and I think I remember talking about this earlier with you guys about what is needed if we just renovated the parking garage. Would we have to disrupt the entire operation, or just to renovate, would we be able to do that in phases, or is it a tear down and build up? And then I also wanted to address the revenues, because our revenues that are going in that, although you said it was profitable, I thought it wasn't enough to maintain the parking garage to its current standards that we would want it to be. I thought that was the earlier discussion.
Well, so first off, on as far as like how we could do the renovation, I mean, we would have to look into that a little bit further, but that was actually one suggestion one of the businesses had made was, had we, is there a possibility to explore a renovation while you keep some of the operations going, and maybe that's a by floor or something like that. That would just be a further analysis that we would have to do on that front. On the revenue side for the parking garage, I believe when we looked at it, expenses were about 1 million, and then, expenses were about 1 million, revenue was about 1.2 million. So it was a little over $200,000 in profit that were coming into the garage. I do know that, speaking with parking administration, that parking garage does have some work that needs to be done, which is why this discussion was timely, because just to understand whether they need to go in and renovate some of those systems that's in the garage or not.
Commissioner Fox.
Thank you. I think there are some issues with the flow of the garage once you get in it, and also when you're kind of coming in and out of it, that I would like to update. But I'm curious what the lifespan of this garage is. Is there any reason that we have to be addressing this now because of safety concerns, or is it just because we had these other concepts that might work at this time?
Yeah, to be clear, the parking garage are structurally sound. There's nothing wrong with the garage, and that's very clear because it's used regularly, and we've talked to parking administration about that. But it is old, and so we just are. This effort is to be timely and just proactive, so that we can properly plan and set a path forward, so that we don't end up, years down the road where we're in sort of a situation where we have to do something that maybe isn't the best or desired, So we have the time now to address whatever concerns we need to properly plan and redevelop the site if the board so chooses.
Commissioner Peduzzi.
To follow up on that question, have we had any engineering studies, whether it be internally or externally, that demonstrate that everything is safe and it's structurally safe, and that it'll continue to be structurally safe for a number of years? Have we done that? And if we haven't, maybe we should look into that just to know what we're dealing with. If in the short term, within the next 5 years, something's going to need to be done, that may change our, our evaluation of this whole potential project.
I don't believe so, but I can follow up with parking administration to find out if there was. We got Armando is raising his hand.
Yeah, take the mic.
Mayor, Commissioner, just to address that question, yeah, parking administration has done engineering studies on other parking garages. As a matter of fact, we're doing some repairs and fixes to the Clematis garage this coming year. And I believe that garage has been part of the evaluation. I'll double check and send an update, but as far as I know, all the garages have had structural engineering firms look at them.
Commissioner Lambert?
Thank you. I guess I just want to follow up on a question that you had, Mayor, about, I know that you've presented, I guess, the top 3 or 4, which was business, office space, housing, hotel. But in the very beginning, you said that there was just, it seemed like an overwhelming response for a sense of place to be here. And, this focus on local businesses or incubator type of thing. And we're not talking about that at all. And I'm just curious if you could shed a little bit of light on that.
Well, we've assumed all the scenarios are at market rate. There's challenges with the general feasibility with some of those even at a market rate. So I think it gets more complicated, if you're looking at uses that generate less revenue. But on the other hand, again, there are other sources of funds. There's other ways to do things to promote projects or project types that are important to the city. Now, I think, the core to shore, I think was viewed as just not financially feasible, so probably not something like that. But, there are, I think, opportunities to work that type of use in or to look at it, to figure out if there's grants or just sources of other financing and things like that.
Follow up, Mayor?
Yes.
Yeah, it was interesting. I wrote down something that I think was anecdotal at one of the sessions that you held, was where some folks were saying we don't need more people downtown, but then you also said that people were saying businesses are fragile. And I would imagine businesses succeed when there's more people downtown. So maybe they were just saying they don't want more businesses that are drawing away. I don't know, that was anecdotal, but I thought it was contradictory. But a sense of place would bring people downtown to visit more of these businesses that might strengthen more of the businesses.
Yeah, I guess I interpreted it as a sense of place for the people who already live and work there, in the area, that more than something that would draw more people. But you're right, it is a little contradictory, because then there was the desire to kind of link the waterfront and things like that. And that I guess happens when you reach out to a broad range of people. I had a second thought I was going to add, and I lost it here.
I guess I'm just thinking, when I think of sense of place, I think of even like the library here, and that is a big draw for people down here, and a great resource in the community.
Yeah, I think I remembered, the comment about the businesses being fragile and everything, I think that was a comment, the context of that was that people don't really like parking garages, so if they are in tune or attuned to using this one and it disappears for a few years, they may completely change their behavior. If they have to come, take a shuttle or walk an extra 4 blocks, they may just say, forget it, I'm not going to Clematis Street or whatever. It's too much of a hassle. That was the larger context there.
Commissioner Ward?
Yeah, that's a concern I have. I don't want to take away parking when we already seem to have a fragile system in place and a very utilized parking garage. But to your point, and I go back to this, YMCA lifestyle commentary that was there. To me, I feel like that's kind of being, I wish that had been looked at a little bit more, because even in Gardens, Lifetime Fitness or whatever, I keep hearing that over and over and over again about families. And even every discussion that I feel like our downtown commissioner has is more people live down here now, and more families live down here, and more families are in the surrounding area. And creating a sense of place where people can come and exercise, drop their kids off, have a public pool. Like, I feel like we don't really have that in this area at all. And if so, we're going to be thinking about, we have the hotels, we have more Class A office space, we have all of these things being built around us. We don't really have that going on here. And so I kind of wish, given the, not wonderfully outlined, like nothing seems outrageously feasible, and nothing seems like, wow, this is an awesome idea that, we're going to be taking and going out for an RFP, and all of those instances, losing parking for a while and having those negative outcomes, that maybe we need to be looking at a broader span of potential possibilities.
Well, I think those 350 spots are taken up by some offices that are down there, and some business uses, and they kind of, Drama Works, for example, has expressed in no uncertain terms how upset they would be if parking was taken away. So it's like there's I don't want to say a sense of entitlement, but they expect, there's an expectation by certain businesses, certain establishments, that those 350 spots are going to be there no matter what. And listen, 90% utilization rate, they're being used. And so that does present a problem if a portion of those was taken away. Now, that's 5 stories. This has the capacity to have 8 stories. So that's 3 stories potentially of unutilized space. Now, your study has shown that there are very few uses that could make it work with just those 3 stories. However, if we went more toward either a nonprofit, a community placemaking, where we're looking at non-traditional sources of revenue, where we're not, if they've got grant capability, I don't know what, but to Commissioner Ward's point, perhaps we need to expand the universe of possibilities for just those 3 spaces, with the understanding that it may not necessarily be a traditional profit-making business that goes there, but there may be other purposes that are served by that business or establishment being there. And I don't know how we would explore that, but we do have the potential for 3, and I don't know how many square feet that is, 3 additional floors that could possibly be developed for something. And I don't know how we drill down deeper to see what would work. Other than the hotel, it seems like that would be feasible. Then we would have to donate a piece of the revenues, parking revenues, to that use, et cetera. But a place of space, of communal well-being, health, and I don't know. Have we explored, fully exhausted, the universe of possibilities for those 3 additional floors? Therein lies the rub. Commissioner Fox?
Thank you so much. As you're saying that, I was just thinking about that last night we voted on an issue that we now have an additional asset downtown that we didn't have before, that if there was some kind of revised, I guess, survey or something that you were going to do, I wonder if it's possible for us to take into consideration that we also have the photographic center space, which is 25,000 square feet. That, in my head, I've always thought that would be the perfect place for 1909. So just thinking about some of the things that the community was really excited about. I did attend that meeting, and things like shared office space and the YMCA, those did come to the top. But we also have this other asset now that maybe somehow that could be part of the mix to utilize some of those community suggestions that we heard. Just a thought. Thank you.
Chris?
Thank you, Mayor. And a couple, having looked at this data and being part of a lot of the engagements, and just the past of sort of viewing this as a hub, I think that there are a lot of goals that we can achieve, whether it's community uses or hotels or things like that, ground floor retail, because the site does offer the ability to wrap the garage with, say, ground floor retail for small businesses that we could look into. There was also a strong desire from our own community events department that if they could do something very unique on the rooftop, that could create sort of that sense of place, in addition to other uses. So when you kind of look at combining several of these things. Some of them are relatively easy. Some of them, we do have to make some choices, whether it's multifamily or hotel or some type of larger community use, like a YMCA or something like that. But I don't want you to feel like we can only pick one. We can actually achieve quite a bit with this asset that I think would be a benefit to the city. And as Commissioner Fox had mentioned, there are maybe some other assets that are available too to achieve some of those other goals as well.
Have we explored, and I don't think it was on the survey, the possibility of remote parking? Just conceptually, and I know this is a public meeting, so I'll probably get pilloried for saying this. I think it is grossly unfortunate to use that building, which is so close to the waterfront, for a parking garage. I just think that, but as I said earlier, people have grown accustomed to using those spaces in that garage. But from just a pure urban planning and urban design standpoint, to have a 5-story parking garage in that key location in our city, it irks me. But I don't know what we can do about it. And so I'm just wondering if the survey or questions or meetings had explored the possibility of some kind of remote parking within a reasonable distance, taking shuttles or something to the businesses where they are, whether we'd even explored that potential possibility. But to have a 5-story parking garage basically on our waterfront, I think is a gross underutilization of that space. So do we explore the remote parking possibility as part of the questions?
We did not, Mayor. Generally because of the high utilization rate, that made it both feasible from a P3 standpoint. That was what made it kind of attractive to begin with. But then also, kind of anticipating that people were going to be have that connection with parking there. But it is something that was brought up in one of the community engagements that some folks had said, why do we need to put parking there at all? So it did come up in the public discourse.
And by the way, do we have a deal with the Ben and Elizabetta's? Do they get a certain number of those parking spaces devoted to them?
They do not.
Do they park cars over there as part of their valet service?
It is used by them on the weekends.
Okay.
Yep.
Somebody else had their hand up, Commissioner Peduzzi.
Thank you, Mayor. I think that your point is well taken about having a parking garage right there in that area on our waterfront, but at the same time, people want to park close to where they're going, and the waterfront is a big attraction, and I'm not so sure that people are going to want to take a shuttle from a remote location into that area. So I think...
Well, I don't know, but I think we can ask the question and see, rather than being anecdotal, let's get the data.
No, I agree 100%. I just think that with the utilization, we really have to look at maintaining parking spaces. That's my biggest take from this thing, is that if it's 90% occupancy, and we've heard that the most important thing to most of the survey group, 47%, was parking. It's still an important aspect, and so I think whatever we do, I think we have to focus on making sure that at somewhere we contemplate how do we replace those parking spaces if we plan on doing something else with that location, because it is important to our residents.
All right, where do we go from President Warren?
I believe that it's an extremely valuable asset and an extremely valuable location, and I think that there's a lot that could be done in that space. It's premium when you think of accessibility to everything downtown. But I think that we cannot ignore the fact that greater than 90% parking rate is extremely high. So I think that it warrants a two-part way forward. One, identifying that it is a very valuable, desirable space, and two, that we cannot compromise on providing a minimum of 350 parking spaces. And when we look at the parking, is there an opportunity to include something that would be a bit more, that would provide more parking spaces than 350?
Chris, do you have something?
I just, based on your note, or your statement, Mayor, about where do we go next, and I didn't know if Commissioner Warren was done, I'm sorry. I just was teeing up the slide. But this is where we're at with essentially the general scope that we had designed. And again, just to recap, when we presented this in February, the whole thought was that each step requires that direction from this board. So this is what it would look like moving forward with phase 2, the solicitation process. And we already have the costs and general deadline set out in order to achieve those. So options for next steps is to move forward with phase 2, to develop that solicitation under one of the proposed scenarios. We could always conclude this project if the board so chooses, or there was lots of other options, additional studies and things like that that were discussed today that we're also looking to get from this body. And that concludes our presentation on this, Mayor.
Okay, I think an essential, before we go even to a phase 2, if that is the will of the body, we need, and I don't know how we get here, Chris, but we need to figure out if there's any construction done here, what the alternative parking plan would be. Because I think we're kind of beating our heads against the wall if we don't have some kind of feasible program for parking these cars if we do any construction there. So I think that's got to be an essential element before we do anything. So I don't know how we can get that information, but if there is a phase 2, I think that is the phase 2, is coming up with a viable parking option, because even as we go out and do community engagement, we got to let people know that we've got a plan for parking if whether we renovate this garage or whether we open it up to other uses, that we have thought about, because that's the first question to ask: where am I going to park? We've got to be able to show them that. So I don't know how we get to that, but I think your team should explore how we get that information and what that looks like, and bring that back to the body.
And I completely agree with that. One thing that I was going to mention in conclusion was just that, Mayor.
Okay.
Across the board, unequivocally, regardless of the direction, is that we do need a plan.
Right.
Because that was the most unanimous statement made by all folks that we've reached out to.
So can you figure out a way to get that and then come back to this group?
Absolutely.
And then maybe after we hear what that plan is, we can figure out what to do with respect to next steps.
Understood.
Does that work for everyone? Because I'm not sure it makes sense to even go to next steps with this until we see what that plan looks like, and how much it's going to cost. Okay, so that's the next step, is coming up with a feasible alternative parking plan. And then we'll start looking at these.
Got it. Are there any additional options? Well, I got it, Mayor. Thank you.
Yeah, let's get the alternative parking plan first, and then we can start talking about the rest of the stuff. Does that work for everyone? Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else on this? All right. Thank you. Next item, 505, 509 Clematis Street lease. Discussion and direction. Ms. Johnson? By the way, thank you, consultants, for your hard work. This has been very useful.
You're very welcome, and
we're
thank you for being.
We're just tabling for now until we get this other information, so don't think that we don't appreciate the hard work that you've done.
I understand that, and thank you for your really insightful and intelligent questions. It's been really a pleasure to.
You're being too kind,
Yeah, well,
but thank you.
thank you.
Mayor, are you ready to move on?
Yes.
Okay, good morning, Mayor, Commission.
Hold on a second. We may have some media coming in. I'll give them 20 seconds to set up, then we can start. I don't know how long it'll take them, but they only get 20 seconds. Okay, you can start.
Good morning, Mayor, Commissioner, members of the public. For the record, Faye Johnson, City Administrator. As the mayor indicated, this item is a discussion for the board and direction regarding the city property that is being leased, which is 505-509 Clematis Street. As the commission is aware, there have been a number of communications back and forth regarding what the city's position is going to be on the lease. By memo dated, well, first of all, the lease is primed to expire on October of 2023, a couple of months from now. By memo dated May 22nd from the city attorney to me, where I requested a list of the options that the board could consider. I sent that to the board. That memo articulated the various options, and those options are what brought us here today to discuss with the board, so that as a body, you all can go through those various options and give staff direction on what is the preference of the board. I have asked Ms. Urchek in filling in for the city attorney, as well as Chris Rube, to present the options to the board, and then to take a look at what the existing lease rates are, as well as what the market study bears in terms of the rates if we were to go forward. So with that, I think Ms. Urchek is going to take the first part of the presentation, and then Mr. Rube will walk the board through what the numbers look like. Ms. Urchek.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So this presentation, as Administrator Johnson just said, would talk about the history of the lease with Tobacco, the request to lease for an additional 5 years, our options for the future. Chris will talk about market rates, and we'll ask for board direction. The property that we're talking about are the two retail spaces that are actually combined to one retail space now in the bottom of the Clematis Street garage. The initial lease with Tobacco was signed in October of 2013 it's a 5-year lease with two 5-year options for renewal. In 2015, Tobacco initially, there's two retail spaces there, and they leased one. The other retail space was leased by another small business bakery, which did not succeed there. So they vacated this space. And then in 2015, Tobacco asked to expand their operation into both spaces, and the city agreed. We amended the lease to, excuse me, include the 505 Clematis Street. That it resulted in additional rent, and they had the larger space, so not the space that they occupy now, which was actually the two retail spaces. That lease technically expired after the first 5 years in 2018. They renewed it for the additional first 5-year renewal term, which expires this October 23rd. The lease provided a second option to renew, but that option to renew needed to be exercised a year in advance. So it should have been exercised last October 2022. It was not exercised at that point in time, and so legally that option expired. The reason that was actually put in there is so that if the tenant or the city determined that space wasn't going to be occupied, the city had enough time, a year, to determine what to do, perhaps put out a solicitation, determine what to do, the purpose being so that the space didn't go unleased for a significant period of time. So that was the point of having that provision in there. That provision has expired. So in April of 23, we received a letter from the tenant's attorney requesting the second renewal for 5 years. We advised, the city attorney advised at that time that option has expired, was no longer available. The tenant has subsequently requested that the city continue to renew its lease for a second extended term of 5 years. Today we'll discuss what our options are regarding that. So the options are, well, technically under the lease for a short period of time, if in fact the tenant doesn't vacate the premises when it expires, the lease provides that one of two things happens. It either becomes a month-to-month lease, and the tenant pays market rate rent, or the city can determine to be a tenant at sufferance if we wanted the tenant to leave, and it'd be double market rate rent. Those are basically short-term, not intended to be how you continue operating the property for a longer period of time. The second option is if the commission determined to keep the tenant in that space, we could negotiate a new lease with the tenant at market rate or within basically the city's lease policy. The third option would be to declare the property surplus again and put out a solicitation for a new lease. It would not prohibit the current lease from participating, the current tenant from participating in that process, but you would solicit proposals from all interested tenants and determine, what you wanted to do at that point in time. So those are the current options, and I think Chris will talk about the market rate rents.
Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners. Chris Rug, Executive Director of the Community Redevelopment Agency.
Good morning.
So just as part of the CRA, we're constantly looking at rents in the areas that are within the CRA. And it's no surprise the city is doing really, really well. We've got lots of investment going on both in existing structures and new structures. And that is obviously having an impact on the market, specifically in downtown. And just recently, I think the values came out. We're seeing double-digit increases in our values again, which is a good thing for the city. But it is going to be reflected in the lease rates, regardless of where you are in the DMP. So what we did is we looked at the leasable space, and 505 and 509 total out to be a little over 2,000 square feet in space. And so when you take that number and then you do a cost per square foot, when we initially signed the lease for the space, it was at $21. And now, the market rate can be as high as $60 in some aspects. Just as a footnote, it is important to note that the closer you get to the water, that generally the higher the market rate number is. So obviously that is a negotiation depending on your tenants, your businesses, and things like that. But generally, the range is pretty solid between $40 and $60 a square foot currently on Clematis Street. So when we looked at that combined 505 and 509, and then you also added a 3% escalation, and taking about the same time period that the current lease has been in place, you're looking at the current rate, which is, again, when that $21 was set, it did have a 3% escalation that was in that agreement. So if we stay consistent with that 3% at the $28 amount, you're looking at a little over $800,000 over the next 10 or 11 years if you were to renew at the current rate. However, if you look at the low end of the market, it's a little over $1 million, and that's at $40 a square foot for the 2,000 plus square feet at 505 and 509. And then it can be as high as $60 a square foot, which is significantly more at $1.7 million. And that's non-ad valorem revenue that goes to the city as a result of that lease rate. So it is pretty valuable space that is on Clematis Street, but that's just indicative of how well the city's doing and the investment that we're currently seeing. So based on the options that the city attorney has laid out and the value of the space that's available, there are three options. Looking at just doing the month-to-month holdover with the existing tenant, negotiating a new 5-year lease with the existing tenant at a market rate rent level, or the last one, which is a new 5-year lease with a new tenant, and that would just go through some type of surplus process and disposition of the property. And that concludes the presentation.
Chris, quick question. Did the market study look at the escalator? Is that 3% etched in stone? happening in the market with escalator clauses now?
Yes, the 3% escalator is based on what we normally do with our lease rates. And so that was just based on the 3% that we put in the last agreement.
Is that consistent with what other landlords are doing on Clematis Street?
That's a good question. Robert, is that generally consistent?
I need you to come to the mic.
Yeah, you got to come up to the mic. To answer your question, Mayor, it is not etched in stone.
Hey, Rob Traeger, the real estate manager for the CRA. Typically, it's 3%. Usually, it can be 4 or 5, or CPI, which makes more sense at these days. But 3% is about typical.
And to note, there are a couple of other things that were recently discovered as it relates to lease rates. There's also a percentage of sales and other aspects that could be explored as part of this market rate negotiation.
Okay, all right, so that there are factors that could be considered in addition to what is in the existing lease if we move forward.
Correct. This
Okay,
is strictly
all right.
just looking at base rent.
All right, very good. Commissioner Ward?
Thank you. Have you already had discussions with the existing tenant on their willingness to go to a market rate?
We have not.
Okay, I'd be in favor of negotiating, given that it's a successful business that's already on Clematis Street, I would actually be in favor of option 2. Obviously, it's not close to the water, so that negotiation on what would be appropriate market rate, I think would lean more towards the lower end, given it's on the western side, but that would be what I'd be in favor of.
Commissioner Fox, then President Warren, then Commissioner Beduzi.
Thank you so much. I, walk Clematis Street every day, and I know that the city is doing phenomenally well, but even this morning, I noticed that the breakfast spot on the 300 block seems to have gone under in the past few weeks. So I think we have a successful business on the 500 block that is paying rent and is successful. I think we put it out to RFP. There's no guarantee that we're going to find another business that's successful. The place is going to sit empty for a year or so, where I feel like an empty spot is not a safe spot. So I would be in favor of moving forward with the 5-year lease as well.
Commissioner Peduzzi?
Thank you, Mayor. I too would be in favor of either allowing them to continue in the space on a month-to-month at the low to mid-market rate, or extending a 5-year lease option at low to mid-market rate.
President Warren?
Thank you. I'm interested in the vacancies, the vacancy rate in that block, and the business turnover rate downtown, is particularly in that area. And if memory serves me well, that space initially was an incubator type of space when Cafe Suites was there, and the space that that Subculture occupied originally was vacant. We used it as an incubator space for them to occupy, and then they grew into those two spaces. The business that was there relocated into Northwood, and so that was a testament to the success of the incubator space. Because Subculture grew, they became successful. I think that we would want to ensure that West Palm Beach downtown is contributing to businesses having the opportunity to succeed in the area versus rapidly turning them over and watching businesses not have the opportunity to grow.
Or the question is, do you want to continue the incubator space philosophy and try to grow new businesses? Something to think about. Commissioner Lambert?
Thank you. I agree with some of the comments that have been made that, I think trying to start over with a new business now would be difficult. The business that's here has a long-standing following. So I would be in favor of extending the lease, whether that is the month-to-month or a 5-year. But I do have a question about that is, do we have a best practice or a standard that we're following now for our leases? Are they typically at one of the previous slide market rate or low market rate now?
Yes, generally, we are doing, unless there is some type of specific purpose that the board is trying to achieve, they're all at market rate.
Great.
Let me just clarify here, because we got two different types of leases. So leases with for-profit organizations are at market, but the board has a number of leases with nonprofits, and under our policy, we lease those at 35% of the market rate. So I just want to be clear there. And when, commissioners, when you give your input about a month-to-month lease, you know, keep in mind that the month-to-month lease is not intended to be a long-term lease situation. So if we're looking by consensus, and I'm not trying to direct the board in any way, but a month-to-month, we would then look to then go through the process of surplusing to find another or open it up for all other interested parties.
Yeah, the month-to-month was seen as if we had come up on the end of the term, which is October, and we hadn't done anything. I see that as kind of a last resort. If you're looking at renewing with the existing tenant, I think you go to trying to negotiate a new 5-year lease at a market rate now, start those negotiations now, so that when the term is up in October, you can, hopefully you've negotiated something, and then you could just ease right into the new term, as opposed to doing a month-to-month. You had a follow-up, Commissioner?
No, I forgot what my question was, but I am good with option 2 and negotiating a near market rate.
Commissioner Peduzzi?
I know I had mentioned month-to-month is an option, but I'm good also with, negotiating a new 5-year lease at market rate, probably in the low to mid-market rate.
All right, anybody else want to weigh in? So, I mean, it seems the sentiment is to go with negotiating a new 5-year lease at market rate. I see heads shaking, nodding. Okay, so that's the direction you want it? You got now, between now and I guess the current lease expires at the end of October, so you'll report back to us as how the negotiations go.
Yeah, we will put together a negotiation team and start the negotiations.
Commissioner Lambert, you had something?
Thank you. Yeah, just a question on the process of our leases. So clearly, as you stated before, the tenant did not meet the expectations of the lease, I think that Nancy mentioned, and that by October of 2022, they were to let us know what their intentions were. They didn't, and so then that tells us that they're not interested. Do we have a process with our current leases, and maybe it's similar to our grant following process, where we're keeping track of things like this so that we can, I'm not saying that it's on the shoulders of the city to get with each of our leasees, but maybe once it has expired, then we could start looking at this in November or December rather than waiting until 6 months down the road.
Yes, we do keep track of leases. We do have a system for keeping track and notifying when they're coming up so that we don't kind of end up with something expiring.
Okay.
At least we do our best to make sure that doesn't happen.
Great. So we do have a process. This one just came to us now due to other extenuating factors and timing?
Well, at the time, we didn't think it was necessarily our responsibility to tell the tenant that their option was going to expire, but we did know that it was coming up in October.
And then once they dropped the ball, if you will, their lawyers started sending letters saying that he wanted to renew, and then that's when our lawyer said, no, you've already. So that's what prompted it, is that we started getting inquiries from the existing tenant's attorney after the 1-year deadline, so that brought it to this point where we had to make a decision. Commissioner Ward?
Not to harp on this, but what were we doing when that deadline occurs, and if there's a system in place that flashes, hey, October's done, now let's start this process of a RFP or new tenant or whatever. So what did we do between October and those letters to to start looking, the whole process is, I understand that, and I think that's market 100%, give us a year to figure out a new tenant. What were we doing until Mr. Krasker started emailing us?
Well, I don't know what we were doing, but at some point, we were going to come to the commission and say, hey, this is where we are. We've got to make a decision because we've got a lease that expires at the end of October. I don't know if we had a certain deadline in mind. You know, her plate's been pretty full trying to run the city. But it was going to come to us at some point.
Yes, and,
But
you
we
know,
built
from-
in a year of flexibility. Doesn't mean we have to start as soon as the year passes, but we have a year, that period of time in which to figure out what our next steps were. This is only June, it expires in October.
Yeah, I was just going to underscore the mayor's point. You know, in terms of where we were in October of 2022, when clearly the responsibility was on the tenant to notify the city. You know, staff did not look at whether or not they submitted that notice to renew and then started working on, you know, the RFP or what have you. Just with all of the other leases and priorities that we were working on, that's not something that we put as a top priority, that we need to now get a workshop before the board and talk through options of whether or not we're going to follow the city's policy and develop the RFP and go out on the street. So we did not do that, is the short answer to the question.
President Warren?
So for clarification, Ms. Urchek, I believe I heard you say that the process is that we notify the tenants when the lease is expiring. What happens for them to know that there's an action that's needed? Because typically in a landlord-tenant relationship, there's something that is initiated by the landlord.
Well, that's not really necessarily true, and especially not with commercial leases.
Okay.
And it's not really our obligation to tell. This one's different because it had the option that expired a year in advance. Many of our leases, when it gets towards, when it's coming, you know, within a few months of expiration, we normally do have some type of contact. This one had a year advance notice, which wasn't provided, but if it didn't have it, by this point in time, there would have been some communication that your lease is terminated and, you know, there's no more renewals. So there would have been. This one, it was just a little bit of an exception because there was a longer period in which they had to exercise their option.
But let us not operate under any misperception. The city did nothing wrong here. We did not fail to meet any type of notice obligation. The lease is the lease. So the city has fulfilled its obligations to the nth degree. We didn't fail to do anything as a city.
That is correct. There is no other lease that we have, and staff can certainly correct me if I'm recalling this incorrectly. There's no other lease that I'm aware of where we have that option in there for renewal, and they have to give the city notice that they want to renew. Some of them are not within a year, that the city then sends them a letter saying, your option to renew is coming up. Do you want to renew? They are the tenants in the city's property. If it's their intent to renew, that obligations fall under them as is prescribed in the lease, that they notify us within that time period. If they do not, we proceed accordingly.
All right, any other questions? Any staff, do you have the proper direction on how you should proceed?
The consensus is that we want to go with option 2, the 5-year lease renewal, and negotiate the rent at market rate, and we will put together the negotiation team and then start that process and report back to the board.
Very good. Thank you. Any other questions? Or any other matters?
Thank you, board.
For the good of the body. I don't have anything. Okay, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much.